since Pesach is Zman Cherutenu, the season of our freedom, Pesach, certainly the freedom from Mitzrayim, the freedom from Egypt. It's all about freedom. And yet here we are all of us in a kind of restrained situation, feeling, maybe perhaps a little unfree, stuck grateful to be home if you're home, stuck in place in a certain sense, not having the liberty of moving around that we usually have. And yet, remember this, in Pesach Mitzrayim, in the Pesach of Egypt, that Pesach itself, how did Bnei Yisrael spend that night, the first part of the night before they left, in what's called here in Israel, bidud, in quarantine. Everyone had to sit in their homes, basically, by families, in small groups, just the number of people that could be fed by one, chad gadya, one little goat, one little sheep, lamb. So it kept people in small groups in quarantine, and yet it was about freedom. So on a certain level, this Pesach, we're going to be commemorating Pesach in a very authentic way, in the same kind of quarantine in a certain sense. I mean, and what they were quarantined because an epidemic was going on outside. Okay, I mean, that's what was going on. We're in a very similar situation. In the midst of that, Bnei Yisrael found freedom. Can everyone hear? In some static here. In the midst of that, everyone found freedom, because freedom is not inimical to restraint. We're having a little bit of trouble with the sound. Meir, you still, can everyone hear me okay? Are you having trouble?
Yeah, there's a little bit of static.
The point is that restraint, and we're in a situation of restraint, is not inimical to freedom. In fact, as we know from any discipline that we do, I mean, when we're looking for a sense of freedom and spontaneity and creativity, we need discipline. Whether it's the discipline of exercise, the discipline of, Matt was practicing his cello, whatever that, we need discipline for real freedom, because we're buffeted by all kinds of forces and passions within us and around us. And discipline gives us a sense of knowing how to filter out what's extraneous, to focus on what's essential, and to develop real freedom. Someone who is hedonistic and just gives into every passion and every desire that they want to do, that's not freedom. They end up being tracked by all kinds of patterns of thought and behavior and habit. Real freedom requires a certain sense of discipline. What we want to do in this session is explore the essence of freedom, the source of freedom, essentially, for all of us. And to this end, I want to look at a meditation practice. We're going to start with hashkata, the way we did last time, with quieting our mind. And then we're going to look at a meditation practice that was done by the early Kabbalists, the Kabbalists of the 13th century and the early 14th century. We'll see two sources on this, and then practice it ourselves. Okay. So let's begin as we did last time with a little 5 minutes of hashkata, of quieting. First, to kind of open up our minds, and this will serve as the basis for the meditation that we'll be doing in the second half of the session. So let me remind us what hashkata is, what this quieting is, the meditation of the Piazetzner and the Rebbe, Zatzal. We sit upright in our chair, or if you're sitting on the floor in an upright position, back straight and self-supported. Best not to be leaning against the back of a chair, just self-supported so you can keep your spine nice and straight. Our feet flat on the floor, hands on our knees. Our eyes will be closed for this. what we're looking for is what will be called in these meditations afisat hamakshava, or hashkata, quieting the cessation of thought, or quieting thought, which sounds like a negative, but it's really a positive. The goal is to quiet that verbal chatter in our mind and become more comprehensively aware of everything that's happening around us and within us. So our eyes will be closed, breathing normally. We want to open up our consciousness to take everything in that's happening all around us and within us. So among the things that's happening is breathing, inhaling and exhaling. Our hearts are beating. If we get quiet, we can feel the beating of our hearts in our chest. We hear sounds around us, sounds in the room. You hear me now. We're sitting on a chair. You can sense the sensation, how you feel the feeling of sitting on a chair, what that feels like. There may be fragrances in the room. There may be a taste that's still on your tongue. Have a sense of everything that's happening in us and around us. And among the things that will be happening is thoughts will arise, verbal thinking, that narrative voice that we have. We don't want to shut it down. What we want to do is back off of it. As the Piasetzner Rebbe says, to be aware that we are thinking, the fact of thinking, but not to follow the themes of the thought of thinking, just back off of it, as if let it happen, let it go. The goal here is to quiet down, to get a state of comprehensive awareness effortlessly, without verbal thinking, aware of everything that's happening in us and around us. And that's the first stage of meditations. Let's try that together. I'll give you a little gong at the beginning and a gong at the end. Doing this for 5 minutes, and then we'll continue on with the particular meditation that we're doing for this session. So 5 minutes of hashkata, of quieting. It's good to meditate with all of you and all of us get quiet together. It's a beautiful thing. So we're on the track of freedom, discovering the source of freedom, the basis of our freedom. That's our goal. And I thought to look at three sources together, which you can find in the, it should be on the side. If you press chat down at the bottom, it should come up. Meir's provided the text. It's three texts. The first one is from the Rambam, Maimonides, and his Guide of the Perplexed. It's a core text. Those of us who have meditated together before, I've brought this text out many times. I think it's the essence, really, it becomes the essence of the Kabbalistic path. And though Maimonides is a great philosopher, but the Kabbalists love this passage in Guide of the Perplexed, and it becomes really the essence of their approach. So this is Guide of the Perplexed, part 3, chapter 52, and read along here. So Maimonides says, a person's sitting and movement and comportment when he is alone in his home, like a lot of us, is not like his sitting and movement and comportment when he is before a great king. Nor is his speech or self-expression, which is as he wishes when he's among his family and relatives. In other words, you can say what you like very casually in a relaxed way when you're with family and friends, relatives. But that's not like his speech when he's in the residence of a king. Because of this, one who chooses human perfection, which is the whole goal of the Guide of the Perplexed to lead us to that, and to be a godly person in truth, not in fantasy, but in truth, should awaken from his sleep and know that the great king who hovers over him and adheres to him constantly is greater than any flesh and blood king, even if he were David or Shlomo, David or Solomon. Now we're expecting where Maimonides is going with this, who is the great king that hovers over us and is with us constantly. But he surprises, he says, this king who adheres and hovers is the intellect. The intellect. For the Rambam, intellect here is what is called the active intellect. It's a term that he gets from Aristotle, and he acknowledges that. It's the collective consciousness of all humanity, and even it's the collective consciousness of all conscious beings on the planet Earth. The intellect here. Intellect doesn't mean intellectual here. Intellect is what we would call cognitive consciousness. Not just consciousness as attention, but aware, meaningful, knowing consciousness. So the king, he says, who adheres and hovers is the intellect, this cognitive consciousness that emanates upon the person, upon him, which is the adherence or the connection between him and Hashem. Okay, so the great king is this collective consciousness of all conscious beings in the world that we live in, which is our connection to God. Blessed be he. Just as we apprehend him, God, by that light which he emanates upon us. Now for Maimonides and in the Kabbalistic tradition, light is a metaphor. And everyone knows, learned with me for any amount of time, you know what this metaphor means. Light is a metaphor for consciousness, okay? So what he's saying here is, just as we apprehend God by that consciousness which he emanates upon us, as it says from Tehillim Psalms, in your light, God, we see light. In other words, in your consciousness, God, we are conscious. So too, by that very light itself, he gazes upon us, and by virtue of it, he is constantly with us, gazing and seeing. What Maimonides is saying here is that we receive our consciousness. We don't know what consciousness is. It's a mystery. It's still a mystery. It's the final frontier of science. What is consciousness? For Maimonides and for the whole Kabbalistic tradition, whatever consciousness is, we receive it from God's consciousness, if we can talk that way. Whatever awareness God has, which is infinite and eternal, we have no grasp of. It's beyond us. But in some sense, something of that consciousness emanates and is the source of our own consciousness on our own little level, in our own little minds. So that our consciousness flows at every moment from God, God's consciousness. That's what Maimonides is saying. That's what the Kabbalists all hold, and we'll see some examples of this in a little bit. But more than that, he's saying, just as we apprehend him by that consciousness which he emanates upon us, as it says, in your light we see light, so too by that very light itself he gazes upon us, and by virtue of it he's constantly with us, gazing and seeing. The consciousness by which we know God or are aware of God is the same consciousness by which God is aware of us. It's one continuum. It's extraordinary. We are in one continuum with God's consciousness. It's amazing. And then, so he says, if that's so, the person, it says in Yirmiyahu and Jeremiah, if a person hides in hidden places, do not see him, says Hashem. Hashem is aware of us along the same continuum that we are aware of Hashem. And he says, understand this well. Okay? It's the very essence of the Guide of the Perplexed. It becomes the essence of Kabbalah. With this basis, that our consciousness is an emanation of divine consciousness, we now move on to two texts which lay out, sort of sketch out a meditation practice that is using this truth. Someone have that text? They want it? The first one is from Rabbeinu Azriel of Gerona. He was a student of the Ramban. Okay. And his commentary in the Aggadot, a Kabbalistic commentary on the Aggadic passages of the Talmud. And he says like this: consciousness extends and ascends to the place of its coming forth. Interesting phrase. Consciousness comes forth from a source, says Rabbeinu Azriel. It's always coming forth from a source. And it also extends and ascends to the place of its coming forth. So we have to understand, well, if it's already coming forth, if we're already receiving our consciousness, then what does it mean to ascend to the source of consciousness? So keep that thought in mind. So consciousness extends and ascends to the place of its coming forth, where it comes from. When it reaches there, it stops and cannot ascend further. So we have the experience, we are in consciousness all the time. Consciousness is not a phenomenon. It doesn't show itself, it allows everything else to show. Okay? It's an extraordinary mystery. It is called it some kind of a field in which everything else appears. But it's not a power, it's not a field, it's totally transparent and allows everything else to appear. And yet, well, we didn't make it. We find ourselves with this consciousness. Quite a mystery. It is what, we live our lives in it. Okay, it is what makes everything possible, and it's a total gift. We sense that it has in some way an origin or a source. We think in those terms, but we can't probe behind consciousness itself, so to speak, to find its source. There's a reason why. He's going to talk about that a little bit. He's going to describe that. It says, when consciousness tries to be aware of itself, is what he's trying to say, ascending to the place of its coming forth, becoming aware of itself, and it's called an ascent in the sense of trying to become more and more self-aware of the pure source of our consciousness itself. If we can talk in source terms, that also is a metaphor, by the way. When it reaches that place where it is most pure, it stops and cannot ascend further. It says, by way of example, a spring of water that issues from its source, if you make a trench below it so that the water not spread here and there, the water will ascend to the place of the source and no more. So the example he has, it's a plumbing example, but if a spring of water is coming up on the surface of the earth, you make a trench around it, the water fills the trench, it will bubble up, but the water will not go higher than where that water comes out at the earth. I mean, there's a rule for that. I forget the name of it. That was back in physics in high school, but there's a rule for why water always never goes higher than the level of its source, unless it's pushed up by a force. So too, consciousness does not ascend more than its place of coming forth. Okay, I'm translating this very literally here so you get the flavor of the text. So consciousness is, we have a sense that, we have this awareness, we have no idea where it comes from. We have some kind of a feeling that it comes from, it's sourced in some way. We cannot reach back to that source, but we can be aware of the purity of that consciousness itself. So Rabbeinu Azil continues, whoever breaks through to think about something that is not within the ability of thought to grasp and adhere to what it cannot grasp, his soul will ascend and be severed and return to its root, or his mind and intellect will become confused. He gives these, what he's referring to here, and those of you who know a little bit of the Talmud Chagiga, or famous cautionary tale about 4 rabbis that entered Pardes, the garden of mystical awareness, Rabbi Akiva, Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, and Elisha ben Abuya. The 3 of those rabbis were not successful. They tried to push their consciousness too far. Ben Azai died, Ben Zoma went insane, Elisha ben Abuya apostatized. Only Rabbi Akiva entered in peace and left in peace, Gemara Chagiga. So he's saying if we try to push our consciousness to go beyond our source, to probe where our source is, it'll drive us nuts. Don't do it, okay? So we can ascend to the purest place of our awareness, but not push it further. And he gives some proof texts for that. From Kohelet and Ben Sira. And then he continues, the 5th line from the bottom of that paragraph. Therefore, the early righteous ones would elevate their thought to the place of its coming forth and would recall the mitzvot and the sfirot, the divine qualities that are discussed in Kabbalah. And from the recollection and thought, adhering intensely, the sfirot would be blessed and increased and receive from the cessation of thought, an interesting phrase, afisat hamachshava, like a person who opens a pool of water and it spreads here and there. For the adhering consciousness is the source and the pool and the spring that does not stop. What Rabbeinu Azriel is cluing us into here is, as we become aware of consciousness itself, and do what he calls ascending to the source of our consciousness, which is a metaphor for becoming more and more aware of the pure non-phenomenon, the presence of consciousness, that which allows everything to be present. As we become more and more aware of it, of consciousness and its purity, which is called an ascent, a rising up, we come to a point that we can't go any further. But that point is a blessed and creative point. That's the point at which we become aware that our consciousness is constantly flowing, so to speak. And that's a metaphor also. Everything is constantly appearing. We're alive. Consciousness is being refreshed at every instant. Okay? And I mean, it's so continual. We don't have a sense of it. It's not, atomistic. It's refreshed continually, so that the world that we see is on the move and alive, and we ourselves are alive. And consciousness is that opening that is the freedom that allows the freedom of everything. It gives us the freedom to move, and the freedom to think, and the freedom to do, and the freedom even also to sit. The freedom for everything bubbles up, so to speak, from that source of consciousness. We can't probe behind that. We'll have to see why in the next text. But we can't push behind that, but it's more than enough if we can abide at that place of consciousness itself, where it is at its purest place, which is called the source that it's coming forth from. Okay, the next text. In a second, just keeping track of time here. Yeah. So the next text is from Rabbi Menachem Recanati. Okay. Rav Recanati was an Italian Kabbalist of the late 13th and mostly in the early 14th century. Very important Torah commentary. He's one of the earliest Kabbalists that brings extensive quotes from the Zohar, which have become available. And Rav Recanati is building on what Rabbeinu Azriel is talking about. He certainly had Rabbeinu Azriel's commentary. And here's what he says. It is known to the masters of Kabbalah that a person's consciousness is the source of the cognitive soul, for it is drawn from there. In other words, our consciousness is the source of our cognitive awareness, of our knowledge awareness. We call our mind, not just in the sense of attention, but in the sense of being aware of the meaning of our experience. The innerness of that is again, a non-phenomenon or a presence that we call consciousness. Consciousness is the source of the cognitive soul, for it is drawn from there, drawn meaning sourced from there. Consciousness, it has the power to ascend and attain up to the place of its coming forth. He's paraphrasing Rabbeinu Azriel. It was early 13th century. When it arrives at the place of its coming forth, to the source, then it adheres to the supernal light from which it is drawn, and this and that become one thing. Now catch the difference here. Rabbeinu Azriel had said, when consciousness arrives at the place of its coming forth, it has to stop. You can't get back behind that, that place of its source. That place of its source is what constitutes us as individual minds, individual human beings with our mind, okay? You can't get back behind that source. To do it will drive you insane, okay? It really is destabilizing. I tried it, don't try it at home. You don't want to get behind that. But the Recanati, Rav Menachem Recanati is saying here that when you arrive at that place, it adheres to the supernal light from which it is drawn. Light, again, consciousness, the supernal consciousness, divine consciousness, from which it is drawn. And that become one thing. So Recanati is doing here, he's putting together Maimonides, who says that our consciousness flows from God's consciousness at every moment and on a single continuum. Okay? We are aware of God, God is aware of us in one continuum. Rabbeinu Azriel said, yes, but we are receiving that consciousness from God, but we can't go all the way back to that. To do that would destroy us. I mean, it would drive our mind insane. Okay? So there's a limit to what we can perceive, but all we can perceive is that whatever this is, this consciousness, it's a total gift. We find it here. We've done nothing to bring it here or bring ourselves here. It is a total gift, and we're in that gift. That gift even precedes our awareness of that gift. And that's as far back as we can go. Recanati is saying, yes, that's true, but to appreciate, we should appreciate what it is we're receiving at that interface between our consciousness and God's consciousness. It's a continuum, there's no break, but we are receiving the supernal light, which in other places is called Or Ein Sof, the infinite consciousness, which each one of us is receiving in our own little way. To continue the plumbing model, so to speak. If you receive water from the street, it comes with a certain pressure. That pressure is too much for your house. So the water in your house that comes through the pipes in your house has what's called a pressure reducing valve. Right after the water comes in from the street after the water meter, there's a pressure reducing valve in many homes, which brings the pressure down to what your pipes can hold. Okay, so in a similar way in celestial plumbing, so to speak, which is a favorite metaphor of the Kabbalists, we are receiving Or Ein Sof, light of the infinite, consciousness of the infinite. But we can't receive that infinite consciousness. So it is stepped down for each one of us. And that's that limit that Rabbeinu Azriel is talking about. Each one of us gets it in a very, we get the trickle of it, so to speak, which is enough for us. We're happy with that. That's our consciousness. But we can't push back behind that valve, so to speak, that steps it down to our level. But Recanati is telling us that nonetheless, it's important to appreciate the source of our consciousness is supernal consciousness. It's God's consciousness, even if we can't probe it. It gives us a sense of the power of what we're receiving. And he goes on to say, it becomes this and that become one thing. Now we're already receiving divine consciousness at all moments. So what does it mean to bring our consciousness back to its sources, to become aware that we are receiving divine consciousness at every moment? That awareness does something. This is what he wants to describe. When consciousness returns to be drawn from above to below, all become like one line. That supernal light is drawn below by the power of consciousness that draws it down, and the divine presence is present below. Now, up and down here, also metaphors. In spirituality, there's no spatiality, so there's no real up and down. So up means becoming more aware of our source. Down means being back in our, in our world with all of its complexity and smallness and all the details and all the multiplicity of it, but bringing some awareness of that supernal source, the infinite consciousness that is the source of our consciousness, so that we're in this world with a sense of what he calls divine presence. Divine presence is our consciousness of God. That's what presence is. It's called the Shekhinah. And the Shekhinah is the totality of we learned this last week, if you remember it, the totality of the consciousness of all Israel, and really of all human beings, is the Shekhinah, the divine presence. So that's a deep self-consciousness or consciousness of consciousness on behalf of all of humanity. So to be aware of the unlimited source of our consciousness is a powerful thing, because we can bring that sense of buoyancy, that sense of unlimited possibility, that sense of freedom into our world, and have a sense of a greater feel for creativity and buoyancy and the way that everything is happening and bubbling up that we can be grateful for, even when we're limited and have to be stuck, so to speak, in our homes, which we'd be grateful for. But we're sort of in restrained and restricted location, it's still free. We're still receiving an unlimited freedom. We're using it in a certain way. We're being restrained for the sake of each other, to keep each other safe. Okay, that's great. And we're using that freedom in a responsible way. So he says, then the bright light is drawn and spreads in that place in which the contemplative person is sitting. Our awareness of our infinite source, even though we can't access it, we can't go back, but we can receive it, we can appreciate it. That brings a bright light into the place in which, bright consciousness, into the place in which the contemplative person is sitting. Therefore, the righteous ones, when they adhere their consciousness to supernal things, draw the supernal light down, and from this, the sphirot have increased and multiplied, as in the incident of Ben Azai, that should read from Shir HaShirim Rabbah, chapter 1, part 2. And this is the secret of the flask of oil that did not cease and the jar of flour of Eliyahu HaNavi, of blessed memory. What he's referring to there is Ben Azai in the Midrash Shir HaShirim Rabbah, also in Vayikra Rabbah, is meditating, learning Torah, and a sense of there's heavenly light all around him. Rabbi Akiva comes in and he sees this light. Ben Azai's aura, his aura is just shining, okay? And Rabbi Akiva, who's sensitive to these things, he could perceive auras, saw Ben Azai is just shining. And says, what's going on here? And Ben Azai is learning Torah, but in a sense of deep, deep connection to the source of consciousness. So too, by Eliyahu Navi, this is an example where he blesses a flask of oil and a jar of flour of a woman and her son, a widow and her son who are destitute. And it just keeps flowing and flowing and coming and coming more and more and more. So Rabbeinu Azriel, the Rekanani's point is that when we get to this source of our consciousness, we open an unlimited sense of conscious awareness and freedom and expansiveness and light, consciousness opened up to its fullest sense. Okay, and that's the goal of this meditation that the Kabbalists used to do. Okay, this is what we want to do now. Okay, so we want to let's put this meditation in place. We'll begin with 5 minutes of clearing our minds, just as we did before, hashkata, quieting down. And for this meditation is properly done by yourself, becoming aware of the source of your consciousness. But since we're doing this for the first time here on this, in Talo Road, and also for Livnot Libanot, our first time. So let me do this again as a kind of guided meditation. It's not a method I like usually, but it's better, but at least for the first time through, this will take you through the pacing of this. So after 5 minutes, you'll hear me begin a narrative. And this narrative will attune us, hopefully, to becoming more and more sensitive to the gift of our consciousness, to sense it as a gift, to become aware of it, to become aware of that it's endlessly creative, it's continuous, it's constantly bubbling, it's happening. And we have a buoyancy here in consciousness that comes, we know not from where, but it's a gift and we accept it. And the goal of this meditation is to become aware and in a certain sense, acknowledge that we are receiving this consciousness at every moment. Okay, that's really the meditation. So I'll carry you through a narrative that will take us, hopefully to recognize that. And then I'll leave off for a while to allow us to really experience this for ourselves and become aware of this ourselves, internalize it. And then at the end, you'll hear again the chime, which is a signal that the meditation is completed. So again, 5 minutes of quieting our mind, of clearing our mind, hashkata, followed by the narrative, which will then cease for a few minutes and allow you to experience the gift of consciousness. Experience it as the gift that it is you. And you don't have to reach out for it. You don't have to imagine anything. Just experience this gift and include your heart in this, by the way. Heart consciousness. We're receiving a gift. When you really receive it, the gratefulness here is endless. Incredible gratefulness for this gift that we are receiving, which is us, the gift of us to ourselves. Okay, and then at the end, the chime. I will suggest at the very end of this meditation, just as the Piazetzner Rebbe suggests, to bring a verse, and I'll say the verse in this case out loud for all of us. And it's the verse actually that from Tanakh that the Rambam, that Maimonides quoted, Ki imcha makor chayim, v'orcha nireh or. And this is the verse of this meditation. For with you, God is the source of life. In your light, we see light. In your consciousness, we are conscious. That's a beautiful verse. Okay, after the gong, the chime, I'll say that verse, and then we open our eyes. Okay, this meditation done with eyes closed. Okay, I hope that's clear enough. We're about to start. Wish everyone hatzlacha, Ezrat Hashem. Here we go. We are here, and we have done nothing to bring ourselves here. We find ourselves here, a gift to ourselves. We can sense our breathing. Inhale, exhale, and it's effortless. Sense our heartbeat. It's happening effortlessly. Sense ourselves sitting on the chair or the floor. We find the ability to sense and to feel, and it's effortless. We can hear sounds. Sounds of a voice, sounds in the room, sounds outside. The ability to hear, it's effortless. Our eyes are closed. You can see lights even on our retina, happening effortlessly. The ability to smell fragrance, to taste. We find we have these abilities effortlessly. Consciousness itself, our awareness, we find ourselves in the midst of it. We've done nothing to make it happen or bring it here. Do nothing to continue it. It's effortless. It's a total gift. We receive our consciousness from an infinite source. Consciousness is refreshed every moment, continually, endlessly. I'll take a few minutes to dwell at the source of consciousness, feeling ourselves receiving consciousness, an endless gift from an infinite source. And to feel the gratefulness for this gift. Our consciousness is the way we experience infinite consciousness, refreshing us at every moment. The experience of freedom, the source of freedom. Ki imcha makor chayim, bo'orcha nira or. With you is the source of life. In your light, we see light.